print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour I will be reading from Sunday, July 26th, issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Radio Reading Service. This article is written by Ross Douthart. Why Vance Still Trumps Rubio in 28. For the first year of the second term presidency, J.D. Vance served primarily as the White House designated tough guy, rather than a softener of Trumpian harshness. He was charged with being, or chose to be, tougher than the president himself, whether that meant publicly pressuring Vladimir Zelensky or defending the Minneapolis immigration crackdown or making a symbolic flight to Greenland, the frozen object of the president's desire. In the past several months, Vance's role has changed. He was the most prominent internal skeptic of the president's decision to attack Iran and the would-be diplomatic disentanglement of the Iranian knot. He has also embarked on somewhat culturally conciliatory book tour and welcomed a new son. Because I think that the Iran war has been a folly and a snare, I have greatly preferred the version of Vance, vice president, to the version that seemed subsumed into driven conservative politics. By contrast, while I thought that Marco Rubio's performance in his first year as Secretary of State was extremely effective, Rubio's performance vis-a-vis Iran has often been a profile in evasion, letting other officials take risk to either own the war or seek a peace while he keeps his options open. Republican Party politics, however, often do not conform to my preferences, and the version of Vance that I preferred is also the version that seems to his internal GOP enemies to be politically weakened, from swarming online attacks to stinging critiques from the Wall Street Journal and Ben Shapiro. There's a palpable sense in the Vance skeptical parts of the right that the vice president is unusually vulnerable, and that a Rubio scenario for 28 may actually be viable. The Vance skeptics have some data on this side. Rubio has crept up on Vance in a new 2028 New Hampshire primary poll, and still not that far below the vice president in betting markets. And you can certainly make a case that being initially right about the Iran war doesn't offer much political upside to the vice president. First, even amid growing doubts about the conflict, most of the Republican base doesn't want to be told that the president made a terrible mistake going to war in the first place, and vice president can't campaign the way regardless. And since Vance can't campaign that way because it has to defend his boss, his position won't be fully satisfying to the anti-war right, either whether embodied by Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan. This dilemma could have been resolved by a Vance peace deal, letting the VP credit Trump with a supposed victory while earning his own credit for deal-making from those who see things clearly. But obviously the efforts to end the war have not succeeded, and the June Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Iran, mainly negotiated by Vance, is currently bobbing, bullet-strafed in the Strait of Hormuz. So you could argue that he's now trapped betwixt and between, a scapegoat for hawks who think the administration hasn't been tough enough, but not successful enough diplomatically to satisfy conservatives looking for a peacemaker. But the challenge for the anti-war voices is that it's not enough to have a story where the Iran war has created various political problems for him. You need a story where is so weakened that Trump himself decide to favor Rubio as the successor, because there's no way that the Secretary of State campaigned against the Vice President without Trump's tacit blessing. Such a story was imaginable at the start of the war if it had gone well. Vance's opposition had looked foolish, and Rubio had then positioned himself as a champion of a successful hawkish foreign policy. But from where we are right now, the position difficulty and stalemate, there's no evidence that Trump regards Vance more skeptical because of his initial opposition to the war. Indeed, there's reporting that the president has warmed to the vice president over the past few months, albeit with Vance's weight loss given partial credit for the shift. In some of Vance's most controversy-courting comments on the war, his critiques of Israel's posture especially almost certainly reflect the president's own frustrations. So how would you get from here to a world where Rubio becomes the heir apparent? If the war grinds on in a stalemate and ends in embarrassment for America, I cannot imagine a successful Republican primary campaign being waged on the premise that J.D. Vance is too dovish or anti-interventionist. If Trump ramps up the hostilities and the war becomes an even bigger debacle, that's bad for all would-be heirs, but hardly a boon for a dump Vance movement. Which leaves only a scenario where Trump simply escalates as vice president, opposes the escalation while the Secretary of State champions it, and the Iranian regime collapses and gas prices with it, leaving Trump with Rubio to thank for victory and Vance to blame for standing in its way. That's the future, where I might bet on Rubio for 2028. But it's also not a future that I would bet on happening. The next article is written by Nicholas Kristof. He's one of my favorites, editorial comment. They're all very good, but I really like him. The war was perfect until it wasn't. We won, President Truman announced on March 11, less than 2 weeks into his Iran war. In the first hour it was over. On March 24th in the Oval Office, he reiterated, the war has been won. On April 11th, Trump posted on social, the United States has completely destroyed Iran's military. The war in Iran is going along swimmingly, Trump said on April 16. It's perfect. The perfection of Trump's war has confused some of his supporters. I don't understand how it's possible Iran has the capabilities to fight the way and continue to try to lash out at Gulf countries and U.S. military bases. Maria Bartiromo, Fox News, said on air recently, because the U.S. has obliterated Iran's military, and the president continues to reiterate that. Yet, Trump's perfect war seems to have a few flaws, including the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and in the past days, the partial closure of the passage to the Red Sea as well. So Trump escalating attacks in which looks like a doubling down on a failed strategy. But the problem now is not Trump's terrible miscalculation in starting the war in February in ways that weaken America, depleted ammunition supplies, reduced our capacity to deter China and Asia, and strengthen Iranian hardliners. Rather, the issue at the moment is the way he is disastrously escalating the war. Trump has lately been striking sites across Iran each day, and he warned that the United States would hit a power plant or a bridge for each ship that Iran struck. Putting aside the question of war crimes, there's also the problem that Iran responds in kind. Iran still retains multiple escalation options, noted Danny Sitonowicz, a retired Israeli defense intelligence expert on Iran. Sitonowicz noted that Iran could attack Persian Gulf states, cut undersea cables, or harness the Houthis in Yemen to attack shipping in the Red Sea. Both sides have already struck water and desalination plants, which could be disastrous for Gulf countries if this continues. Iran is heavily dependent on desalinization. Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates rely on desalinization for almost all of their drinking water. Cities could become pretty much uninhabitable if power plants and desalinization plants are destroyed. Likewise, if the United States attacks Iranian oil and gas sites, Iran is likely to do the same in Gulf countries, reducing the flow of oil for months or years. The Houthis have announced that they have joined the conflict, targeting Saudi maritime traffic in the Red Sea and thus diminishing global oil supplies even more. Trump is threatening to strike the Houthis, but he should remember that he and Joe Biden before him spent $7 billion bombing the Houthis for a bit more than 2 years and achieved nothing. Trump extricated himself from bombing campaign in May of 2025. With a standard diplomatic magic trick, both sides declared victory, and the bombing ended. What is Trump trying to achieve by ramping up attacks? What's the intent? Any realistic strategy should begin with one core assumption: Iran is unlikely to capitulate, Citrinowicz said. In other words, increased airstrikes seem a fiery dead end. I hope Trump isn't considering invading with ground troops, for that would be even more disastrous. Barry R. McCaffrey, retired general, estimated it would take a year and 600,000 American troops to subdue Iran, taking casualties along the way. Then what? McCaffrey asked. Stay? I do see one military escalation that could be useful to squeeze Iran. Help the United Arab Emirates recover the disputed islands of Greater TUNB, Lesser TUNB, and Abu Musa. If the Emirates are willing to do this without their troops rather than ours. Iran forcibly seized the islands in 1971, but the Emirates have a plausible claim, and the islands are strategically located by the Strait of Hormuz and could help control it. Beyond that, there's really no alternative but negotiation, recognizing that any negotiation outcome will be unpalatable, though not as unpalatable as escalating a war to nowhere. Perhaps the most important aim of negotiation would be keeping Iran from getting nuclear weapons, but Trump's foolish nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia, it goes forward, will make that even harder. Indeed, I'm increasingly fearful that the most dismal legacy of this catastrophic war may be that a decade or two from now, both Saudi Arabia and Iran will have nuclear weapons. Two unstable, misogynist Middle Eastern autocracies with nuclear weapons. What could go wrong? Next article is written by Jamel Bowie. Trump's new insult won't save the Republicans. President Trump knows that he's unpopular. This is why he's become even more obsessed with election fraud, why he fumed and rambled about the 2020 election for a primetime audience this month, and why he wants Congress to pass the Save America Act, a bill that, in his mind, would make it impossible for Democrats to win the midterm elections. This is why both he and his Republican allies are throwing everything they have at Democrats in an attempt to find a message that sticks with the public, a message that could help them hold Congress for another 2 years. And what Trump and the Republican Party have settled on to spearhead their campaign against the Democratic Party is the threat of communism. That's right, communism. It's unclear exactly what Trump has in mind when he says communism, although there is no reason to think that the president could distinguish Marxism, Leninism from Maoism or Trotskyism or some other more boutique formulation. Whatever his meaning, the important point is that communism is for the president the single greatest threat to the safety, prosperity, and integrity of the United States. Communism is a moral threat to American liberty, he said at a semi-quintessential event at Mount Rushmore. It is the greatest threat to our country, including World War I, World War II, Pearl Harbor, or even 9/11. The next day, in his Independence Day speech on the National Mall, Trump was even more emphatic about the threat communism poses. The communist system is the opposite of American system, and the communist system has never worked. Our warriors did not fight communism on battlefields across the world to have the menace rear its ugly head right back here in America. We're not going to let it happen. Following the president's direction, Republican leaders in Congress have pledged to fight the Red Menace, trying to explicitly to the Democratic Party. The Bolshevik takeover of the Democratic Party is in full swing, and communism is on the ballot this November. Representative Steve Scalise of Louisiana, the House Majority Leader, said, "One imagines that we'll soon see Republicans quoting Alexander Kolchak and waving the banner of the White Army." It is clear that all of this is a response to the recent success of resurgent left-wing candidates in Democratic parties, especially those with ties to Democratic Socialists of America. These candidates who won Democratic primaries, most recently Milat Quiros of Colorado, are not communists. DSA origin, in fact, lie in part with the Democratic Socialist Organization Committee, whose leadership came from the anti-communist left. But it's perhaps too much to expect American conservatives to distinguish between the many flaws of left-wing politics in the United States. In any case, Republicans hope to wield the public long-standing hostility to socialism as a weapon against Democratic Party politicians, whether or not they fall on the left or call themselves Democratic Socialists. But Americans are neither as hostile to socialism as they once were, nor as positive toward capitalism as they've been in the past. More importantly than polling, however, is the fact that for many Americans, the communist threat is a total abstraction. There are tens of millions of voters, this columnist included, who were young children when the Soviet Union fell. There are a million more who were yet born. For these Americans, communism is as much a concern as the missile gap or the Contras. It is completely unresponsive to circumstances of their lives, to their struggles with housing and health care and the overall cost of living. As a message, communism is out of touch with reality. You can understand the two Trump presidencies as attempts to relive and reenact the most atrocious moments in American history, as if the nation is led by toxic obsession who relish the cruelty and criminality of the past and who worship perpetrators as heroes, the supposedly hard men who built the country we know. The president himself gestures toward this game of copycat when he hails Andrew Jackson or praises William McKinley as a man who made America great. And the administration itself seems to consciously want to emulate those moments of infamy and ignorability in the American past. Of course, this president and this administration would want to emulate the anti-communist satire of the 1910s and 50s. Of course, he and the administration want to resurrect the fear, bitterness, paranoia that marked the hunt for alleged subversives. Both Trump and his movement are, as you might surmise from the slogan, "Make America Great Again," fundamentally derivative. His vision of the future rests on a rotten nostalgia, and his plans for getting there were drawn from the wreckage of a shameful past. President's attempt to drum up a third Red Scare is certain to fail. If it matters, if it is interesting, it is only because he gives us a glimpse into the stunted imagination of a man who seems to value only the worst this country has to offer. The next article is written by Maureen Dowd. Nolan's Zero Arrows Odyssey. Medievalist must be jealous. Editorial comment, that's a new word for me. Medievalist. Medievalist. Classicist that having a moment of social media happily discussing whether Odysseus was Polytropis or Polymetis or Polychaos, and that's very cool. Thank you, Mr. Nolan. Another editorial comment, I don't know if you read Shakespeare. I did in high school, but can't remember too much about it. Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is a throwback to the days when Hollywood big shots furiously took on literary classics, undaunted by the challenge of bringing vast, thorny tales to the screen. Nolan's Portal of Ancient Greece has lured audience back to the theaters and spiked book sales of Homer's The Odyssey, over 12,000 times of dactylic hexameter verse composed in the 7th or 8th century B.C. Nolan has turned one of the fundamental works of Western literature into an entertaining adventure saga. Nolan told Stephen Colbert that he used every trick in the book to achieve his stunning visual effects, yet the director failed to capture the essence of the man of tricks and twists, Odysseus, who delighted in storytelling and feigned identities. Much of the moral ambiguity has been drained to make Matt Damon's protagonist more likable, except for a few mournful appearances by Zendaya's Athena, who seems more like Odysseus' conscience than his shape-shifting partner in Deception. Nolan doesn't depict any of the major meddling goals from the story. Besides being rich, fascinating characters, the gods are the framework for everything that happened in the ancient world. If you take the gods out of the picture, you just have people struggling with themselves. You lose the depth and force of the epic. Nolan's nearly 3-hour masterwork, the classicist Mary Bird noted, does not have Homer's elusive sexiness. In keeping with Gen X's waning interest in sex, the poem's famous sex scenes have been excised, sapping erotic power from the female characters. As a headline in New York Magazine wondered, is no one horny in the Odyssey? Nolan brought the dark spirit of his last hit, Oppenheimer, with him to Greece, imbuing Odysseus with shame about his brilliant engineering invention, and won the war. The horse that tricked the Trojans. His Odyssey is filled with remorse and haunted by the idea that his actions led to the end of a civilization as they knew it. Homer's guy, not so much. After Odysseus and his men sacked Troy, they went across the way and sacked another city. Emily Wilson, whose popular modern translation of the Odyssey inspired Nolan and the director in Odysseus into an all-American hero weighted down by anxieties foreign to the ancient Greeks. He's traumatized Jason Bourne, she said of Damon's portrayal on Derek Thompson's podcast. He's an action hero who feels bad about being an action hero. It's not that complicated. Unfortunately, he's not the talent of Mr. Ripley in this film. The Odysseus of the Greek poem is complicated. Nolan did not want his Odysseus betraying Penelope and enjoying his sojourns with other women. The director completely cut out the young princess Nausicaa, whom Homer's Odysseus has a flirtation with and neuters the text sexual encounters with Circe and Calypso. In Homer, Odysseus sails to Aea, the island home of the enchanting sorceress Circe, the nymph with the lovely braids. I named my kitten after that Circe. When Circe drugs Odysseus' crew and taps the men with her wand, turning them into swine, it's witchy foreplay. He was so smitten with the lustrous goddess who doted on him with sides of meat and draughts of heady wine, he didn't leave for a year, despite pleas from his homesick men. Nolan's Circe, played by Samantha Morton, is like a vindictive feminist hippie, making certain pots in Vermont, except she's sculpting pigs. Her romance with Odysseus is scrubbed. In Homer, Odysseus lands on the island of another luminous goddess, Calypso, and stays 7 years. He's in prison, but all the beginning, he's enjoyed himself. He's and his Penelope was fending off the boorish suitor back home. Nolan whitewashes Odysseus' infidelity here by turning Calypso, played by Charlize Theron, into a fashionable speech therapist who gives mood-altering lotus flowers to help with the PTSD. In Homer, Odysseus has no need to forget. He cries once over the human cost of the war when he hears a song about Troy's fall, but mostly he's proud of his war exploits. Nolan's IMAX Odysseus gives up the crown for his son and goes into exile, with Penelope to redeem his actions during the war. Homer's hero, no way. Homer did not portray a world turning against violence. He lined a profoundly marital universe interspersed with lots of image and sex and cavorting, conniving immortals. If you smooth it out and modernize it too much, you lose what made it so important to begin with, and yet you're just left with a guy finding his way home. Readers, it would be interesting if any of you go and see the Odyssey. Now, this is written by Hannah Note, is the author of the following book, We Shall Outlast Them, Putin's Global Campaign to Defeat the West. No matter what the West does, Putin will not yield. Putin is now isolated from the world more than ever, President Joe Biden proclaimed in a State of the Union address in March of 22. 1 week before, President Putin of Russia ordered his tanks into Ukraine, prompting Western nations to sever ties with Russia and throw their support behind Kiev. The shock over Mr. Putin's brazen grab reverberated across the globe. Many expected Russia to turn into a bête noire. Another editorial comment, I'll have to look up what a bête noire means. Obviously, the war is night. But it soon dawned on Russian adversaries that the country wasn't going anywhere. Forced to prepare for a long war, the Kremlin instructed its diplomats, intellectuals, and operatives to secure support for non-Western world. Many countries proved receptive to Russia overtures, refusing to be forced into a binary choice between Russia and the West. Russia soon became something curious. the country facing more sanctions than any in the world, yet more than able to stay afloat. Estrangement from Europe was offset by ever closer relations with the global South. To make sense of this turn of events, I set off on a journey around the globe. Traveling to over a dozen countries, I spoke with the politicians and people who support Russia. And I interviewed Russians who propel the Kremlin agenda for Moscow and those who operate on the periphery. The question was simple. How has Russia managed to weather its rejection by the West? What I found was a testament to the country's relentless adaptation. No matter what the West does, Russia will not yield. In Dubai, the success of Russia's economic maneuvering were unmistakable. After the invasion, the United Arab Emirates became a hotspot of Russia's wartime strategy, a haven for Russia's rich relocating their business, a conduit for Russian traders importing Chinese goods, and a hub for Russian banks settling non-dollar payments, the Russia shadow tankers, ferrying Russia's oil to willing buyers across Asia. The UAE became a place to shape, shift, and camouflage. In the netherworlds of shell companies and obliging professional, Russia was able to sidestep Western sanctions. Other Russian schemes were more sinister. In the Alabuga Special Economic Zone, some 600 miles east of Moscow, sits a hub for the assembly of Iranian-origin drones used to pummel Ukraine. Central to the effort is a pseudo-vocational program that has targeted young African women to work there, with administrators making false promises of career advancement and a life filled with love and marriage. Sprawled across social media platforms, the recruitment spree was just a tiny fragment of Moscow's information campaign in Africa, which scored points by framing Russia as an antidote to the neo-colonial West. In Vienna, New York, I witnessed the loftier forms of Russian power plays that the United Nations Russian diplomats worked hard to corral non-Western countries to support their position, including on the war in Ukraine. Russian diplomats also used fewer formats to woo friends, chairing the BRICS alliance in 2024. The Kremlin impressed its partners with hundreds of events, among them a fashion show, a sports tournament, grand summit in the city of Kazan, a formidable Russian host. Russia made clear that it would not be isolated. In South Africa, there was little need for persuasion. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the African National Congress, the country's dominant political force, which had led the fight against apartheid, blamed Western nations for the war. Meeting with ANC veterans, I saw how gratitude for Soviet support during the anti-apartheid struggle, combined with antipathy toward a West to them, appear both hypocritical and hyper-dominant. The result was a reflectively pro-Russia stance that tended to dismiss Ukraine's distinct identity and agency. I also met individuals whose affinity for Russia was more idiosyncratic. The journalist Paula Seiler grew up in the affluent Johannesburg suburb in the 80s, immune to the kind of pro-Russian sentiment that the ANC underground cultivated. After joining Russia Today, a state-funded news channel, on a whim in 25, she slowly internalized its news culture. Even as the channel's propaganda grew shriller over the years, she continued to consider her work necessary and right in the global information war. She told me Russia was the underdog. Others have aligned with Russia more out of self-interest than affection. In Georgia, the ruling party Georgian Dream followed Russia's lead in cracking down on civil society. Ahead of the parliamentary election in October 2024, Georgian Dream warned that the Global War Party, its political opponents, and their Western supporters sought to drag Russia into conflict with Russia, as has happened in Ukraine. Georgian dream's goal was simple: to entrench the party's hold on power in the process, to advance Mr. Putin's agenda of discrediting Western-style democracy and building up fellow travelers in the region. Huh. If Russia could count on converted and circumstantial abettors alike, its war against Ukraine also generated other, even improbable, resistors. The young urbanites with whom I mingled in Almaty, Kazakhstan, worried about their country, sharing the second longest border in the world with Russia, could become the next victim of Mr. Putin's aggression. They spearheaded efforts of decolonization from Russia, advocating the use of the Kazakh language over Russian in everyday life, alongside erecting with ugly dimensional of Imperial Russian and Soviet policies in I had trouble pronouncing it, Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan. In Armenia, people felt abandoned by Russia rather than fearful of its encroachment. September 23, with the Kremlin preoccupied Ukraine, Russian peacekeepers stood by as Azerbaijan took over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. Asad Adama, a pub owner I met in Yerevan, was among tens of thousands displaced from the enclave. Mr. Putin's portrait no longer hung in his pub, reopening the Armenian capital. Other Karabakh Armenians blame the Armenian government, which has since scrambled to diversity its foreign partners, for their predicament. Either way, Russia's prestige took a blow. Armenian story hints at a broader phenomenon, which the Kremlin's success is securing support has been able to mask. Russia's global power is steadily eroding. I sensed it most strongly during my travels in the Middle East in the early 2025. In Meja Shams, a border town in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, I sat down with Druze residents who were celebrating Bashar al-Assad's recent ouster in neighboring Syria. A major defeat for the Kremlin, a decades-long supporter of Assad dynasty until it wasn't able to protect its client. President Trump returned to the White House has generally worsened Russia's predicament. His campaign promise of an anti-interventionist foreign policy had given way to U.S. military operations against Iran and Venezuela, both Russian partners. Having boasted that he could settle the Ukrainian war in 24 hours and hit it, he might do it by caving to Russian demands, Mr. Trump has since grown tired of the conflict. Distracted by the aftershocks of his military gamble in the Persian Gulf, the prospect of a new bilateral relationship, while remained unfulfilled. With Trumpian intercession, Russia must fight on in Ukraine. The cost is mounting, estimated 1.4 million Russian battlefield casualties. Ukrainian droves that now reach deep into Russia in a sputtering economy. Yet having made the whole country subservient to the needs of the calamitous war, Mr. Putin understands that the result was determine Russia's global reputation. Our friends, our neighbors, and our adversaries and enemies all keeping a close eye on the way it unfolds, as Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently reminded an elite gathering in Moscow. For all the jeopardy of the war, Mr. Putin has gambled in outlasting the West. In a world that harbors a seemingly undepletable well of admirers and adherents, along with countless enablers and facilitators, his bet may yet pay off. So much is left unfinished with Epstein. The author, No Visible Bruises, by Rachel Louise Snyder. The Donald A. Trump and Jeffrey Epstein Memorial Reading Room recently came to Washington, a pop-up exhibition that displayed 3,437 bound volumes of the Epstein files that have been released. So far, I wondered what 3.5 million pages even look like. I can answer that now. It looked like a sobering image of our vast collective failure. How do we address the magnitude of that failure? What can justice mean for the survivors at this point? Release the files, meaning release all the files, has become the shorthand of the failure. A rallying cry that people and institutions who failed to stop Mr. Epstein should be held accountable. Though the files were ordered to be released on December 2025 after Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act, what we've had instead from the Department of Justice is dumps of incomplete information with haphazard redactions. Justice seems a long way off. It was particularly gutting to watch the journalist Katie Fang and the Epstein survivor Danny Bensky walk through the reading room and see Ms. Bensky calculate the sordid history that preceded her 2004 victimization. All they needed to do was station a police car outside the mansions, he said. Even for those implicated in his crimes, there's precious little real accountability. Mr. Epstein is dead. Jean-Luc Brunet, an associate with Epstein charged with raping minors, is also dead. Suicide. Parisian jail, 2022. Ghislaine Maxwell is incarcerated, however gently, in her minimum security prison. Meanwhile, for people who are Mr. Epstein's social networks, the consequences have generally been slight. Some, like Larry Summer, have lost their professional standing, while others, like Noam Chomsky, have taken reputation hits. A few, including Bill Gates and Woody Allen, have endured a measure of public shaming. But a news cycle or two, President Trump continues to claim no wrongdoing. Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Deutsche Bank have settled civil suits brought on by Mr. Epstein's victims, who accuse the banks of facilitating or ignoring Mr. Epstein's sex trafficking. In total, they've agreed to pay more than $400 million, a sum dwarfed by their profits, of course. The idea that payment equates to justice strikes me as not merely a cold feature of capitalism, but also an expression of our American tendency to conflate people's wealth with their human value. The conflation underlies the cynical calculation that financial institutions apparently made to do business with Mr. Epstein in the first place. Regulators have found that Deutsche Bank allowed suspicious transactions linked to Mr. Epstein's account proceed, fact that the bank deemed him high risk. J.P. Morgan staff raised concerns about Mr. Epstein as far back as 2006, 7 years before the bank dropped him as a client. What if we demanded that these institutions not merely pay a settlement, but repay every penny of profit If you deliver enough of return on investment, I guess you can stuff your hollow moral center with cash. Talk to any woman who says she has endured the kind of abuse, and you'll be quickly rid of the notion that true justice requires only a monetary payoff. Elva Johnson, who sued Mr. Trump, stating that he forcibly kissed her while she was working for his 2016 campaign, told me, it's a constant reliving of something so horrific that happened. No amount of money, truthfully, can ever make you whole. Ms. Johnson, who eventually dropped her lawsuit, is one of the more than 24 women who've accused Mr. Trump of sexual misconduct. The reading room is named after both men for a reason. Women like her are seen as damaged goods, she said. It can be difficult to find employment when you're spoken out against powerful men. She visited the reading room when it opened. When I saw my name on the wall, it was like my heart just sank. It's still so surreal that this is your life, she said. The president has disputed Ms. Johnson's account and denied the allegations of sexual misconduct. I went to the full floor. One side of the room was represented Mr. Epstein's victims with hundreds of candles, and the others held images of index cards written by visitors. Grateful, angry, heartbroken. More than one card, another asked cuttingly, who were we? The binders in the reading room should be understood as evidence of a global criminal enterprise that sold and transported girls and women. The evil genius of traffickers like Epstein and Maxwell is that they created criminal liability for their victims, said Martin Vandenberg, the president of the Human Trafficking Legal Council. Trafficking often works this way, even street level, by making victims collide in the crime by coercing them with money or threats to bringing in their friends or acquaintances. The Epstein crime seemed a live concern in Europe, which has been leading the way toward justice. French prosecutors recently learned of around 10 new people thought to be victims of Mr. Epstein's network. Norway is investigating a former prime minister and former diplomat in connection with their ties to Epstein. February, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, King Charles' brother, was arrested as part of an investigation into misconduct in public office over his ties to Epstein. These international pressures may be the catalyst for truly determining who could criminally with Mr. Epstein versus the merely aborted him. In the United States, we must consider holding to account the women who enabled or turned blind eye to Mr. Epstein's crimes. I mean, not just who were directly engaged in the sexual assault of children, but also those in financial institutions who ignored his suspicious transactions, and those investigators and law enforcement officials who failed to protect the victims or to hold him truly accountable for his crimes. For this, an independent investigation led by an international body would be ordeal. Let's include another look at Mr. Epstein's 2000 deal under Alexander Acosta, then the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. The deal allowed Mr. Epstein to serve just 13 months in jail and leave custody nearly every day to work out of an office. Such a soft sentence seemed to embolden him. After his release, he stepped effortlessly back into the upper echelons of wealth and power. A Congressional Oversight Committee is conducting an investigation of the Justice Department's handling of its investigation into Mr. Epstein's. Lawmakers have proposed legislation to lift the statute of limitations for civil claims on sex trafficking and sexual abuse. The first day of Todd Blann's state confirmation to become the permanent Attorney General, Representative Thomas Masel introduced the Epstein File Transparency Act, which would allow state attorney general to bring suits against the Department of Justice for non-cooperation in the release of the files. These are promising, if a meager start. I stayed in the reading room for a little over an hour. One of Mr. Epstein's survivors sat thumbing through a binder under the Department of Justice slapdash retractions. The general public is not allowed to open and read the volumes. Another survivor sat on a couch underneath the stairs, turning pages while two young children played up beside her. Both of the women struck me as preternaturally silent, the kind of shock signs you feel in the immediate wake of an accident, before reality sets in. By the time I left, the line to enter ran down the block and around the corner. Even if the Department of Justice is done with the Epstein files, the public is not done with justice. This article is certainly apropos of what's happening in France and Spain. Nothing can prevent the new wildfires. We have to adapt. Climate anomalies arrive first as a shock, then as a pattern. But what does the pattern reveal? The skies above New York are now clear of smoke after several grim and portentous days, when parents worried over whether to keep their children indoors, and the middle-aged worried over the health and safety of their parents, and plenty of others endured just a throat-burning dread, with deja vu indistinguishable from environmental foreboding. For New Yorkers, less than 2 weeks later, it may seem almost to have been a bad dream. But particulars still hang thick as soup over large parts of the upper Midwest. More than 900 fires were still burning across Canada as of Friday, and dozens of new fires were ignited by lightning storms across Oregon and Washington and British Columbia last weekend. Already they have burned hundreds of thousands of acres, spewing plumes of hazardous air across the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada. So when the sky cleared over the Meadowlands last Sunday, the billions of eyes turned towards the World Cup to be played there. What future did we all see? Per person smoke exposure in the United States has surged over the last decade, now 4 times as high it was between 2006 and 2019. And even before the apocalyptic Canadian wildfire of 2023, when Americans on the eastern seaboard were introduced to the eerie orange skies they had believed possible only in fire-prone places like California and Australia. More Americans were dying of wildfire smoke-related deaths east of the Mississippi from west of it. Smoke events weren't exactly unheard of in the eastern seaboard, though there aren't too many people still alive to remember the great smoke pall of the Shenandoah fire of 1950, for instance. But again and again, with environmental disarray, and we tell ourselves it's still rare, even in a world racked by warnings becoming more and more common. That is true of the 1,000-year floods in the Texas Hill Country, which claimed the lives of 139 people last summer, including 27 girls drowned at Camp Mystic, and which struck another 12 months later. It is true of the European heat waves that have historically come once every 28,000 years, but they have grown 100 times as likely over the last couple of decades. And it's true of oppressive smoke events blanketing the East Coast. However unusual the weather patterns that carry ash and particulates from Canada and megafires to American megalopolis to the southeast to be common enough that we have to get used to encountering them in our eyes, our throats, and our lungs, our emergency rooms also. For now, exposure events like those tend to last a few days at most. The length of these ominous seemingly weather events, like thunderstorms or extreme heat, which we take mostly in stride, perhaps in time we'll relate to smoke the same as we do to thunderstorms, with some measure of adaptation as acclimatization and somewhat less ruin-reading and hair-rending about the future of life outside. Most harrowing, we have to get used to more fires also, not just across the continent, but closer to our doorstep. Last year, 49% of Americans, wildfires began in the east, believe it or not. And if you draw a line from Minnesota to Texas, more than 2/3 of last year's fires burned to the east of that. Most of them were pretty small, as Jevin Lang wrote this year in an eye-opening survey of the future, that American East. But the number of large fires there has been gone tenfold over the last 40 years. Let me just read that again. That's interesting. 49% of American wildfires begin in the east. You would only, if you didn't read that, you would think it would be 10% in the east and 90% in the west. Last year, when monster Canadian fires dumped their exhaust across the border, some Republican congressmen faulted the government of Canada for the quality of American air. This year, that pattern repeated itself. A bit more loudly, with the president threatening tariffs against the neighbors to the north, and Republican senators and representatives promising that the tariffs would be used to establish a victim compensation fund and pay for the cleanup. But megafires in landscapes soar in might that cannot be reached by car are not the fault of forest management, as the climate scientist Zeke Hosfather detailed this month. As Michael Ware of Stanford put it, wildfire smoke, particularly from the Boreal Forest of Canada, cannot be controlled. And to me, these new reactionary climate politics are among the most ominous signs of the new age of megafire, that in the face of ecological and human disaster, a growing number of politicians are eager to bully and scapegoat. Perhaps it shouldn't come as a surprise, even the years of warning, that climate change might not inspire global solidarity, but the opposite, an intensifying narrow-sum competition over a world pinched by perceived resource scarcity and pockmarked by more and more frequent extreme weather. If you insist on believing that climate change isn't real or that its effect must be trivial, then whatever you find yourself overwhelmed by these effects, you have to place the blame somewhere. This has been an eye-opening decade for fire in North America, with the sudden return of the urban firestorms Santa Rosa, Lahaina, and Boulder. It was, in its way, a message of hope that we could take control of what the historical Stephen Pyne has called pyrocene and wrestle ourselves back to a position of real ownership over this terrifying combustible landscape. By reversing those choices, it would mean reintroducing a lot more good fire onto the landscape than the form prescribed in indigenous burning. It would require a different and much more attentive approach to forest management, and it require redesigning some communities and retrofitting a lot of homes. But it could be done. An editorial comment on fires. It really affected everyone, especially, I guess, if you lived in New York City. And when in our area, we were taking precautions. I stayed in the house just like I did for COVID. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from Sunday, July 26th issue of the New York Times Opinion section. We read from the New York Times Opinion section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader's been Dick Shanley. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability